I'm Drew Stevenson, and this is a lecture for my administrative law class. This is part 3 of a little series on the social safety net. And we're talking about administrative law and public benefits. And here we're going to be talking about prioritizing programs and the concerns that come up with these government agencies and government programs. Why are we talking about this? Because even though we have an aspect of administrative law that's about regulating industries, the financial sector, oil and gas sector, the railroads, and the airlines, and so forth, we have a big component of our administrative law and regulatory state that's about public benefits and public assistance programs, the Social Security Administration, the Veterans Administration, and so forth. And you're going to have a number of cases in your casebook about these very programs and how they work. And if they're unfamiliar to you, this will be helpful. I'm trying in these videos to just give you what you really need to know to understand those big cases like Mathews v. Eldridge and Goldberg v. Kelly, Richardson v. Perales, and so forth. So let's dive in and take a look at our slides. Okay, we have some recurring legal concerns or issues that come up again and again. One is the strictness of the eligibility requirements, and you may have some cases that you encounter that talk about this. This is part of the majority and dissent debate in Goldberg v. Kelly, for example. So the idea is the government, we have a certain risk of error in determinations, right? And so do we calibrate our eligibility requirements and process so to be inclusive or to ensure that nobody gets benefits if they weren't really supposed to? And so on the one hand, if you take a lot of pains to and make things really strict so that nobody gets benefits that they shouldn't, maybe that's good, right? Because you don't want cheaters. You don't want people who aren't eligible for the program getting signed up by fraud or worker error, caseworker error. But on the other hand, if you make things very strict and onerous, some number of people who you actually really wanted to help with this program are going to fall through the cracks. They will be disqualified due to some technicality, or the process will be so complicated that they just give up. And so this is an issue that comes up anytime we have a government program, whether it's federal, state, or local, that is in some way trying to help people in the population or be part of our social safety net. Also, keep in mind as you read all of these cases that there's a constant issue with program overhead costs. And in the three-part test of Mathews v. Eldridge, this is essentially most of what they're talking about with the third factor in that three-part test. So any program that you run, you need staff to run this program, right? Is this a foster care system? Is this vouchers for people to get child care? Is this, are you having government run food pantries, right? Or a government distribution of a vaccine or things like that? Well, no matter what you're doing, you are going to have staff. You're going to have to pay those people. They're going to have offices or buildings or cubicles at least, phones and computers, a parking lot for them. And this adds up very quickly. So remember that there's always overhead costs. The bigger the program, the bigger the overhead. And the more people that you need, the more facilities you need, the more facilities you need in more locations. And the more procedural protections you provide for people who are part of these programs, that's going to add another layer of overhead costs. Also, related to this is the right to a hearing when you're denied or terminated. And so some programs, we may give you a hearing when we cut you off, but if we think you're ineligible, we might not give you a hearing beforehand. So the courts have to make some difficult decisions as to the agencies of how they're going to handle hearing rights, how many hearings, how elaborate is the hearing, and so forth. And you get a hearing if your application is incomplete, can you get a hearing ahead of time to see if you qualify before you bother applying, going through the rigorous and burdensome process of applying? And what about when you're terminated, and do we have to continue your benefits while we're waiting to do a hearing? There are complicated issues that run through all of these cases in your administrative law casebook about the relationship between the federal government, state governments, and local governments. Some of this is kind of expressly stated in the cases where the federal government is funding something and the state or local agencies are supposed to implement it and put it in, basically distribute the funds. You can also have situations where the federal government somehow has a program that preempts the state, or a state preempts localities from trying to do certain types of, provide for certain types of provisions. You could think of some of the controversy about things that the social safety net for immigrants, for example, and the controversy about sanctuary cities and so forth. But there's another issue that you should think about here, and that is whether it's better to have local control or federal control. And the arguments, as you can imagine, there's trade-offs. If you had, should we have a uniform program so that an individual who moves from Maryland to California, it's going to be the same program, the same benefits, the same eligibility requirements. If we do something on the federal scale, we can get economies of scale, right? Because it's so big. We can have a big program. We can get funding right from Congress, and maybe we can hire really sophisticated, smart people to run the program. On the other hand, right, the localized program, you have people who actually know the people in their community and understand their needs. And sometimes this works better than a one-size-fits-all federal program. And so remember that from a standpoint of if information about the needy individuals matters, then the more localized we can make the control, the more effective the program might be. Also, remember that there's this recurring argument, both in the political sphere, and sometimes you're going to see it like hinted at by the courts, of hurting the people you're trying to help by engendering laziness or complacency, right? That you've given people a disincentive to work because they could just stay at home. And people have said this for decades, right? About welfare programs and cash assistance to the poor, that people are basically being paid to stay at home, so they're not motivated to try to find a job. But we've had this during the 2020 pandemic with the stimulus checks that people received. If you followed the news about it, many Americans, some number of Americans, were actually made more or had more income coming in while they were out of work during the COVID-related closures and shutdowns because of the stimulus checks. And so keep that in mind, that this can get very complicated. And do we think that the same disincentives apply to stimulus checks or unemployment income that applies to assistance for those living in poverty and those with children at home? A more nuanced argument or problem comes up when we talk about crowding out private charity. So we have some spheres in our communities where before the government started a program, the same people were being helped, or similar services were being provided by, let's say, religious organizations, churches, synagogues, and temples and mosques, and the or religious sort of parachurch organizations, right? Missions organizations, convents. And when the government comes in, a lot of times those other entities will pull out, and because they could spend why be redundant when they could spend their scarce resources on a different type. Maybe now they'll do tutoring or have a college scholarship, or shift their resources to overseas missionary work or something like that. And so there's a concern that when the government steps in, it actually may crowd out private charity. And then that raises questions of, are private charities more efficient than government programs? And sometimes people just assume an answer to that question. They either think absolutely yes or absolutely no, or private charities come with all these strings attached, like you have to join someone's religion or something like that. But those things are really kind of vary in their truthfulness on a case-by-case basis. We also have this constant problem of figuring out what are the priorities, or who is the priority for our target group. And so think about, like, should we, if we're going to have programs and we have scarce resources, should we make sure we help the children in poverty? Why? Because we want them to grow up and have a life. They can't really escape or change their situation, right? You can't tell a little kid, a 4-year-old kid, go get a job, or why did you make those bad decisions that put you in this situation, or something like that. So the children who are in poverty are there through no fault of their own. And this, by the way, resonates broadly with, has a bipartisan appeal. Of course, we should take care of the children. People feel the same way about the elderly, right? The vulnerable members of our society who are too old to be in the workforce. In some cases, and or at least too old to be doing certain types of jobs. And so should the children and the elderly be priorities? And I want you to see that both of these are basically age determinants. Others would say the real priority should be people who are disabled, who have a chronic illness or an injury that really is debilitating and takes them out of the workforce, again, with the idea of helplessness or a lack of it being their fault. But of course, this can get complicated too. And how do you weigh the priority between children, the elderly, and the disabled? Others would say that we should prioritize vets. And by the way, if you've been looking at this list for a couple minutes, I have arranged the list roughly in the order of how we have prioritized things in the United States for the last 100 years. So by vets, I mean veterans, right? And so some people feel like we owe an obligation to our veterans because they served in the military, they defended our freedom, and so forth. And certainly serving in the military during the same years that other people are launching their careers, starting their families, buying their first home, then you come out of the military service and you kind of have to catch up on life a little bit. That was sort of the 20th century thinking. And if you don't have programs to take care of your veterans, a lot of them do fall into poverty. We also have a question of whether we should prioritize rural versus the urban poor. And the problems with poverty, some are the same everywhere and some are different, right? So the urban poor are more likely to have problems with high crime, as you might expect, than people who don't have that much contact with other people because they live so far apart. So sometimes the people in rural areas, so let's talk about Appalachia or something like that, will feel like their real problem is they lack job opportunities, they don't have good schools, they don't have a lot of contact with other people or opportunities for social networking, and so forth. And they will look at the big cities and think, wow, the poor people there that's where all the jobs are, and that's where the good schools are, and there's a million opportunities for them. And so maybe we should help the rural poor first. The urban poor, of course, think that they have a different set of problems. So even though they have more infrastructure and schools and maybe jobs around them, they're also more likely to be in neighborhoods that are beset by crime or gangs or things like that, or face very intense social divides that like discrimination. And so keep in mind that this is a difficult issue both for the federal government and the state governments to decide how to prioritize the rural poverty issues versus urban poverty issues. Okay, next let's talk about disaster relief, right? So we have a hurricane, a wildfire, floods, tornadoes. In some parts of the country, earthquakes can have devastating consequences. And this creates a different, sort of a unique type of poverty where you could have people who were working and maybe well off and had their own homes and things like that. And everything in their life was taken away from them in one day because of the hurricane or the wildfire or something like that. And so we have these programs that are emergency assistance to help these people bounce back and get back on their feet. A lot of them, they have credentials, they have work history, they can continue at their jobs and so forth, but they are temporarily dislocated and or displaced peoples and homeless, maybe they don't have transportation and so forth. So some would argue that this should be the priority because with a little bit of help, these people will bounce back and be right back in the workforce and right back where they were a year before. And that's different than something like the basing things on age, where with children, you really do kind of have to wait for them to grow up. Right. And if someone is too elderly to work, they're not going to get more able to work over time. People become more elderly over time. Okay, race, of course, is just a constant problem in our society. So we had a long period, a tragic period of our history where we had race-based slavery. So a big segment of our population were bought and sold and treated as property. They were exploited for their manual labor. Their children were treated as property and taken away and sold and so forth. And during that time, the majority white population was building a family heritage of farms and land and access and educating their children and so forth. And so it's no accident or weird coincidence that poverty is disproportionately impacts racial minorities in our society. And it's not just African Americans. We could talk about the long period for decades and decades and decades of our history where we waged a campaign of genocide against the Native Americans so that we could take their lands and eventually confined them to remote reservations where, again, they have been beset by generations of poverty. A lot of our Native American reservations have problems with poverty. And so the question then becomes how much should we prioritize allocating our relief programs based on trying to account for race. And we could also talk about ongoing discrimination, mass incarceration of our minorities, and so forth. And of course, there are language minorities, people who struggle with English or have a foreign accent, national origin discrimination, some religions face discrimination, and so forth. Well, I have to tell you, watch for this. It varies with the program. So with Social Security disability, for example, the Social Security system prioritizes children, the elderly, and disabled, and does not take any account of race whatsoever, right? So we don't have more benefits. You're not more likely to, there's no recognition that race affects your employment, right, ability, or your ability, how likely you are to be taken out of the workforce due to a disability. So we have some public assistance programs where we really haven't accounted for race at all. And others where that is a factor and a consideration. We have other things we could consider, like crime victims, right? People who have been victims of assault. A lot of times that is a big setback in their life that can affect, put them in need and lower their socioeconomic status. Now, I want to close with a thought experiment that sometimes I use for class discussions, because again, depending on where you grew up, what kind of family you grew up in, and who you had contact with growing up, the whole idea of poverty and the poor in America can be very confusing. And maybe people have a lot of stereotypes that they don't realize. So here's one way of thinking about poverty, is to think about financial security. So I want you to think about big setbacks in life, right? The loss of a job, right? Having your partner or spouse or parents or child have uh, a chronic illness, right? Like cancer or something that requires months of hospitalization and treatment or something like that. Or some type of injury where a person is bedridden for months recovering, or the loss of a home due to fire, or even just plain old foreclosure and eviction. And so we all have setbacks happen to us. A lot of us are going to get fired at some point, or have be rejected by a loved one, or total our car and be without transportation for a few days or weeks or something like that, or struggle with a sickness. But now I want you to think about how many of those things could you handle all at once before you would go into a free fall, like beyond the point of no return so that you're not coming back. And so the fact is, some people, let's say you have a law student who went to law school straight from college, and they total their car and get evicted from their apartment, and their boyfriend or girlfriend breaks up with them, and maybe they flunk out of school, right? Or get fired from their first law job. Well, a lot of people can move in with their parents until they get back on their feet, right? In our society, but other people can't. And so if you have a family that's sort of a safety net for you, that helps you absorb some of these shocks. So many of the people in poverty, when I was a legal aid lawyer, this was something I observed, that a lot of the people in poverty in our society are one step from the point of no return, right? One more big setback. If they are the victim of a crime, if they get evicted from their apartment, if their benefits get cut off, it's going to set off a cascade of unpleasant consequences, and they are never coming back from that, right? So some of us could incur a major setback, or even 2 or 3, and a year later, maybe it'll take 5 years, we will be right back where we want to be. But think about, like, is there some number of these major catastrophes in life where you're kind of done for good? You're never going to get back on your feet. A lot of the middle class people in our society, I speculate or imagine, could absorb 3 or 4 major setbacks in a row, like let's say within a month's time, and still eventually, it might take a year, it might take a couple of years, kind of be back where they started. If you're well off, or you're in the upper class, it might be a few more, 6 or 7, 10, because you have wealthy friends, you own multiple homes, you have you have 3 cars for every person in your family, or things like that. You have a year's salary in your savings account built up. And so if you are all set, right, in that sense, and then you could incur a lot of these. But we do have people in our society that are really one step from the line of homelessness or permanent homelessness. And that's one way to think about why we have this social safety net, is that we don't all have the same type of backup plan if everything falls apart for us. And what do we do about the people who don't have parents they can move in with, who don't have friends they could stay with, who don't have a college or law school mentor or professor who could counsel them and start making calls for them and help them get another job when they get fired, or don't have any savings? And so think about that when you're thinking about these programs, and think about that as you're thinking about the way judges in these cases talk about the petitioners and the recipients of these programs. Okay, that concludes our third and final lecture about our social safety net and what you really need to know about poverty law for your administrative law class.